On the afternoon of January 21, 1944, a staff car sat motionless on the gravel drive outside Norfolk House in St. James's Square, London, refusing to advance the final 40 feet to the entrance of Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Inside that car sat Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., temporarily commanding the 1st United States Army Group. His jaw was clenched, his ivory-handled revolvers pressed against his ribs beneath his immaculate uniform, his eyes locked on the Georgian doorway where 2 military policemen stood at attention. The temperature hovered at 38 degrees Fahrenheit. A cold January drizzle fell steadily, turning the square's bare trees black against the gray London sky. The air smelled of wet pavement and coal smoke, and the particular dampness that settles into English winters. And George Patton would not move. Inside that building, in a second-floor conference room thick with cigarette smoke and strategic tension, General Dwight D. Eisenhower was conducting the final command conference for Operation Overlord, the invasion of France. Maps covered every wall. Intelligence officers stood ready with reports. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery sat at Eisenhower's right hand, already designated to command all ground forces during the initial phase of the invasion. Major General Omar Bradley sat across from him, recently promoted to Lieutenant General, recently given command of 1st U.S. Army, soon to command 12th Army Group when additional American forces became operational. They were planning the most important military operation in human history, and they were doing it without George Patton. Patton's driver, Master Sergeant William George Meeks, sat behind the wheel and kept his eyes forward. He had driven the general for 18 months through North Africa and Sicily, through triumph and controversy, and he had learned that when Patton's face went flat and expressionless, like a death mask, when his breathing became slow and controlled, when his hands rested motionless on his knees, the best course of action was absolute silence. Patton's aide, Major Alexander Stiller, sat in the front passenger seat, also quiet, also waiting. He knew exactly what this was about. Everyone on Patton's skeleton staff knew what this was about. This was about the fact that George S. Patton, Jr., the most aggressive, most successful, most combat-proven American commander in the European theater, had been summoned to this meeting not to receive command assignments, not to contribute to operational planning, not to lead armies across the beaches of Normandy, but to be informed that he would spend D-Day in England, commanding an army group that didn't exist, pretending to prepare for an invasion that would never happen, serving as bait in an elaborate deception to fool German intelligence while lesser men made history without him. The staff car sat there for 23 minutes. Stiller counted them on his watch, wondering at what point they would have to acknowledge they were simply not going in. Then Patton spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, controlled in that way that meant volcanic rage held in check by sheer force of will. "Stiller, I'll walk from here. Tell Meeks to circle the square and return in exactly 1 hour." It was a compromise that preserved his pride. Patton would not arrive at Eisenhower's headquarters like an eager subordinate rushing to a meeting. He would arrive on foot, alone, as if he just happened to be in the neighborhood and decided to stop by. He would walk through that door under his own power, on his own terms, answering no man's summons. He stepped out of the car into the drizzle, adjusted his helmet, and walked toward the entrance with the rigid posture of a man approaching an execution, his footsteps echoing on the wet pavement. The relationship between George Patton and Dwight D. Eisenhower had not always been poisoned by exclusion and resentment. Once they had been friends, companions, kindred spirits who believed armor would revolutionize warfare. Once, in 1919 at Camp Meade, Maryland, they had spent hours discussing tank tactics, testing experimental vehicles, writing papers together about the future of mechanized combat. They had been captains then, both passed over for promotion after World War I, both frustrated by the Army's peacetime conservatism, both convinced that the next war would be won by speed and mobility and aggressive commanders willing to exploit breakthrough. Patton was the older man by 5 years, the more experienced soldier, the veteran of combat in Mexico and France.
Eisenhower had never heard a shot fired in anger, had spent the entire First World War training tank crews in Pennsylvania. But Eisenhower had a mind that understood systems and logistics and organizational complexity in ways that complemented Patton's tactical brilliance. They had respected each other's gifts. They had enjoyed each other's company. They had been, in the limited way senior officers can be, friends.
That was before the career trajectories diverged, before Eisenhower's talent for staff work and political navigation pulled him upward through the ranks, while Patton remained brilliant and difficult and perpetually controversial. That was before Eisenhower became the man who would decide Patton's fate, who would protect him from his own mistakes, who would use his abilities while containing his damage, who would ultimately exclude him from the greatest operation of the war because George Patton could not stop being George Patton. But to understand why Patton stood in that drizzle outside Norfolk House, refusing to enter until his pride allowed it, you have to go back further than their friendship at Camp Meade. You have to go back to the fundamental difference in their characters, to the fact that Eisenhower understood that wars were political enterprises requiring coalition management and diplomatic skill, while Patton understood that battles were won by killing the enemy faster and more ruthlessly than he could kill you, and everything else was just interference from people who didn't have the stomach for what war actually required. Patton had been shaped by combat in ways Eisenhower never was. In 1916, as a lieutenant serving with General Pershing's punitive expedition into Mexico, Patton had killed 2 of Pancho Villa's men in a gunfight, strapped their bodies to the hood of his car, and driven back to headquarters like a hunter displaying his trophies. In 1918, commanding the 1st American Tank Brigade in France, he had been shot through the leg while leading his tanks forward on foot during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, had refused evacuation until he passed out from blood loss, had been decorated for valor while lying in a field hospital. Patton knew what it felt like to kill men face to face. He knew what it sounded like when tank crews burned alive in disabled vehicles. He knew the smell of cordite and blood and gangrene, and he had built his entire identity around the conviction that combat was the only activity that revealed a man's true worth. Eisenhower had never experienced any of that. His war had been fought behind desks, in training camps, coordinating logistics and personnel assignments. He was brilliant at it, had risen rapidly through staff positions precisely because he understood how to make large organizations function efficiently. But he had never led men under fire, never made life or death decisions in the chaos of battle, never felt the visceral terror and exhilaration that defined combat. And Patton, in his darkest moments, believed that this fundamental difference disqualified Eisenhower from judging combat commanders, from deciding who should lead and who should follow. Except Eisenhower was deciding. In December 1943, he had been appointed Supreme Commander Allied Expeditionary Force, given authority over all Allied ground, air, and naval forces for the invasion of France. And one of his first decisions was determining who would command American ground forces during and after the invasion. The choice came down to 2 men, both lieutenant generals, both proven in combat, both with strengths and weaknesses that Eisenhower understood intimately because he had worked with both of them for years. Omar Bradley, methodical, dependable, easy to work with, respected by British commanders, politically savvy enough to navigate the complications of coalition warfare. And George Patton, aggressive, brilliant, inspirational to his troops, tactically superior to any commander in the theater, and also volatile, politically toxic, incapable of controlling his mouth or his temper, perpetually one incident away from career-ending disaster. Eisenhower made the safe choice. He gave Bradley command of 1st Army for the invasion, with the understanding that Bradley would later command 12th Army Group, overseeing multiple armies as they fought across France. And he gave Patton command of 3rd Army, which would become operational after the beachhead was secure, under Bradley's direction. And he gave Patton one other assignment, the one that brought him to Norfolk House on that cold January afternoon, in a car he refused to drive those final 40 feet. Patton would command FUSAG, 1st United States Army Group, a phantom force that existed only on paper and in German intelligence reports, positioned in southeastern England opposite the Pas-de-Calais, transmitting radio traffic and conducting exercises designed to convince the Germans that the invasion would come at Calais rather than Normandy. Patton would be bait. The most famous American general, The one the Germans feared most would spend the most important operation in military history pretending to command divisions that didn't exist, giving speeches at public events to be photographed and reported, maintaining an elaborate fiction while real commanders led real armies into real combat. When Eisenhower's chief of staff, Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, had presented this assignment to Patton in a preliminary meeting 3 days earlier, Patton had sat in silence for a full minute before speaking. His voice when it came was so cold and controlled that Smith later told colleagues it was more frightening than any of Patton's famous rages. So I'm to be a decoy, a puppet, a cardboard general for the Germans to worry about while Bradley commands armies. Smith had tried to explain the strategic necessity, the critical importance of the deception plan, the fact that Patton's reputation made him perfect for the role precisely because the Germans would believe he would lead the main invasion force.
None of it mattered. Patton understood what this really was: punishment for Sicily, for the slapping incidents that had nearly ended his career, for being too brilliant and too difficult for Eisenhower to trust with independent command. Now, 3 days later, Patton was being summoned to the formal briefing where Eisenhower would present the complete command structure for Overlord to all senior officers. Patton would sit in that room and listen to Bradley's assignments, Montgomery's assignments, the Corps commander's assignments, the Air commander's assignments. He would hear his own role described as deception operations and subsequent exploitation after breakout. He would see the organizational charts that showed him subordinate to Bradley, the man he had mentored, the man who had never heard a shot fired in anger before North Africa, the man who thought in terms of phase lines and consolidation, while Patton thought in terms of breakthrough and pursuit. So Patton sat in that staff car outside Norfolk House and refused to move, refused to rush, refused to arrive like an eager subordinate grateful for whatever scraps of command Eisenhower deigned to throw him. 23 minutes of private rebellion, of silent protest, of George Patton asserting the only control he had left over a situation that had spiraled completely beyond his ability to influence. Finally, he stepped out into the rain and walked toward the entrance. The MPs snapped to attention. One opened a door. Patton walked through without acknowledging them, water dripping from his helmet, his boots clicking on the marble floor of the entrance hall, his face composed into an expression of absolute neutrality that revealed nothing of the rage and humiliation churning beneath it. He climbed the stairs to the second floor. An aide met him at the landing and gestured toward the conference room. Patton could hear voices inside, the low murmur of officers gathering before a briefing. He paused at the doorway, straightened his uniform, adjusted his tie, prepared himself to walk into a room full of men who were about to witness his demotion from combat legend to theatrical prop. Then he walked in. Eisenhower looked up from the map table and smiled with that carefully calibrated warmth he had perfected over years of coalition command. "George, good of you to come. We're just about to start." Patton nodded, but said nothing. He found a seat near the back of the room, deliberately choosing a position that communicated his detachment, his reluctance, his silent judgment of everything that was about to be said. Bradley was already seated near the front, reviewing notes. Montgomery stood by one of the wall maps, pointing out features to a British Corps commander. Other generals filled the room, men Patton knew, men he had fought alongside, men who would now watch him receive orders from officers he considered his inferiors. Eisenhower began the briefing at 14:45 hours. He spoke for 20 minutes about the strategic situation, the importance of Overlord, the challenges of amphibious assault against fortified positions, the necessity of coordination between Allied forces. His voice was measured, confident, the voice of a man who had grown into supreme command through careful management of difficult personalities and competing national interests. He acknowledged the risks, praised the planning staffs, emphasized that success would require unprecedented cooperation between American, British, and Canadian forces. Then he began announcing command assignments. Montgomery would command 21st Army Group, overseeing all ground forces during the initial phase until sufficient American forces were ashore to justify separate command structures. Bradley would command 1st U.S. Army during the invasion, then assume command of 12th Army Group once additional American armies became operational. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges would eventually take over 1st Army when Bradley moved up. Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. would command 3rd Army, which would become operational approximately 60 days after D-Day, and would serve under 12th Army Group direction. Patton listened to his name being mentioned almost as an afterthought, his assignment described in the passive voice, his role defined entirely in relation to Bradley's command. Eisenhower continued, explaining that Patton would also command FUSAG as part of Operation Fortitude, the deception plan designed to convince the Germans that the invasion would strike at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. This assignment, Eisenhower stressed, was crucial to the success of the entire operation. German forces positioned to defend Calais could not be allowed to reinforce Normandy during the critical first weeks. Patton's reputation, his visibility, his known aggressive style made him the perfect commander for this phantom force. The Germans would believe he would lead the main invasion, would hold their reserves in place waiting for him, would waste divisions defending against an attack that would never come. It was all true. It was strategically sound. It was the kind of brilliant deception that could save thousands of Allied lives. And it meant that George Patton would sit in England giving fake speeches to fake divisions while the largest military operation in history unfolded without him. Eisenhower asked if there were questions. A few corps commanders asked about logistics, about air support priorities, about coordination procedures between British and American units. Patton said nothing. He sat with his arms crossed, his face expressionless, radiating a hostility so palpable that several officers near him shifted uncomfortably in their chairs.
After the briefing ended, officers gathered in small groups, discussing assignments, coordinating schedules, planning follow-up meetings. Bradley approached Patton, his face showing concern mixed with something that might have been pity. "George, I know this isn't what you wanted. But once 3rd Army activates, once we break out of the hedgerows, you'll have exactly the kind of war you're designed for. Open country, mobile operations, pursuit. That's when we'll need you most." Patton looked at him with eyes that had gone flat and cold. "I'm sure you'll let me know when that time comes, Brad, since you'll be giving the orders." Bradley flinched slightly, then recovered. "We're on the same side, George. We're trying to win a war." "Some of us have been trying to win it for a while now. Some of us didn't spend World War I training recruits in Missouri while other men did the fighting." It was a low blow, deliberately cruel, designed to wound. Bradley's lack of combat experience before North Africa was something he had always been sensitive about, something Patton knew would cut deep. Bradley's expression hardened. "I can't change the past, George, and I can't change Ike's decisions, but I can promise you that when 3rd Army becomes operational, you'll have every resource you need to do what you do best." Patton stood abruptly. "I have to get back to my phantom headquarters to plan phantom operations with phantom divisions. Enjoy the real war, Brad." He walked out without saluting, without shaking hands, without any of the military courtesies that normally concluded such encounters. Several officers watched him go, exchanging glances that mixed sympathy with relief that they didn't have to manage George Patton's ego and talent and perpetual resentment. But to understand the depth of Patton's bitterness on that January afternoon, you have to understand what he had accomplished in the 16 months since North Africa, what he had proven, and what he had destroyed through his own lack of self-control.
In March 1943, after the disaster at Kesserine Pass, where German armor had smashed through green American forces and revealed how unprepared the U.S. Army was for combat against experienced opponents, Eisenhower had given Patton command of 2nd Corps with orders to rebuild its confidence and capability. Patton had transformed that demoralized unit in 6 weeks through relentless discipline, aggressive training, and a personal leadership style that combined inspiration with intimidation. He had fined soldiers for not wearing helmets, court-martialed officers for incompetence, shown up at forward positions to personally observe attacks, driven his subordinates toward higher standards of performance. The Corps had responded. Its confidence returned, its tactical proficiency improved. When Patton led it into battle during the final drive toward Tunis, it fought well. Then, in April 1943, Eisenhower had executed the plan he had always intended, giving 2nd Corps to Bradley while promoting Patton to command 7th Army for the invasion of Sicily. Sicily was supposed to be Patton's triumph, his chance to prove that American forces, led by aggressive commanders, could match the British, could outmaneuver the Germans, could win campaigns through speed and audacity rather than methodical advances. And Patton had delivered brilliantly. 7th Army's performance in Sicily was outstanding. Patton had driven his divisions forward with relentless energy, outflanking German positions, capturing Palermo in a dramatic sweep, racing Montgomery to Messina, and arriving first. He had personally led from the front, showing up at critical moments to inspire his troops, pushing his commanders to move faster and hit harder. By any measure of combat effectiveness, Patton's leadership in Sicily was exactly what he had promised it would be. But then, on August 3rd and August 10th, 1943, George Patton had visited field hospitals to see wounded soldiers and had ended up slapping 2 different men whom he believed were malingering, were faking combat fatigue to avoid duty. He had called them cowards, he had screamed at them, he had threatened to have them shot. In one incident, he had drawn his pistol. Medical staff had witnessed both events. Within days, reporters knew about them. Within weeks, Eisenhower was receiving demands for Patton's dismissal from politicians in Washington and senior officers who believed such conduct was inexcusable. Eisenhower had faced an impossible choice. Patton was his most aggressive, most capable combat commander, possibly the only American general who could match Montgomery for drive and tactical imagination. The invasion of France was being planned for 1944, and Eisenhower needed commanders who could break through fortified positions, exploit breakthroughs, pursue defeated enemies with the kind of relentless aggression that won campaigns. Patton could do all of that better than anyone else in the American Army. But Patton had also assaulted hospitalized soldiers. He had violated every standard of leadership and decency. The press was calling for his head. Politicians in Washington were demanding explanations.
Eisenhower had compromised. He had reprimanded Patton privately but severely, making him apologize to the soldiers he had hit, to the medical staff who had witnessed it, to every division in 7th Army and personal visits where Patton had to stand before his troops and acknowledge his mistake. It was humiliating for a man like Patton, a public degradation that he never forgave Eisenhower for imposing. But Eisenhower had kept him in command. He had protected Patton from dismissal because he believed the Army would need him in France. Except when the planning for Operation Overlord reached the point where specific command assignments had to be made, Eisenhower had not given Patton an Army group. He had not given him command of all American ground forces in the invasion. He had given that job to Omar Bradley. Bradley, who had performed well in Tunisia and Sicily, who had shown he could coordinate multiple divisions effectively, who had demonstrated the kind of steady, reliable competence that coalition warfare required. Bradley, who had never slapped a soldier, never threatened to shoot a man suffering from combat fatigue, never created political scandals that required intervention from the Supreme Commander. The decision made perfect sense from Eisenhower's perspective. Bradley was solid, dependable,
easy to work with, good at coordinating with British commanders, unlikely to create problems. Patton was brilliant but volatile, a genius at exploitation but terrible at administration, inspiring to his troops but infuriating to his superiors. So Eisenhower had created a command structure where Bradley would oversee multiple armies as they fought across France, while Patton would command one of those armies, Third Army, under Bradley's direction. When Patton learned of this arrangement in early January 1944, he was devastated. His diary entries from that period are bitter, resentful, filled with self-pity and rage. He had been the teacher, Bradley the student. He had been the combat veteran. Bradley had never heard a shot fired before North Africa. He had liberated Palermo and won the race to Messina, while Bradley methodically reduced German positions in northern Sicily. And now Bradley would be his boss. Bradley would issue him orders. Bradley would evaluate his performance. Bradley, the plodding infantryman who thought in terms of phase lines and consolidation, would direct George Patton, the cavalryman who thought in terms of breakthrough and pursuit. Patton convinced himself it was political. Eisenhower was protecting himself by promoting the safe choice over the brilliant one. Marshall and the War Department were punishing him for Sicily, for the slapping incidents, for being too aggressive and too honest about the nature of war. The Russians had insisted on it because they were afraid of what Patton might accomplish if given full authority. Every explanation except the obvious one, which was that Patton had destroyed his own career through lack of self-control. Now, in late January 1944, Patton sat in his quarters at Piover Hall in Cheshire, staring at maps of France that showed Bradley's projected advance routes, Montgomery's zones of operation, the beaches where other men would land, while George Patton pretended to command phantom divisions in southeastern England. The headquarters was cold, despite the coal fires burning in the fireplaces. The British winter had settled into that gray dampness that never quite lifts, that seeps into buildings and bones and spirits. His staff tried to keep busy with the deception planning, working out radio transmission schedules for FUSOG, arranging public appearances, coordinating with British intelligence officers who were managing the broader Operation Fortitude. But everyone knew this was theater, performance, elaborate lying rather than actual military operations. Patton met with his staff officers and gave orders about things that didn't matter, preparations for invasions that would never happen, training schedules for divisions that didn't exist. Then in April 1944, 2 months before D-Day, George Patton attended the opening of a welcome club for American soldiers in Knutsford, England. He was asked to make brief remarks. He said something about how it was the evident destiny of the British and Americans to rule the world. His comments were reported in the press. The reaction was immediate and furious. The Russians, who were American allies, were not mentioned in Patton's vision of post-war order. Politicians in Washington were outraged at the implication of Anglo-American global domination. Eisenhower, already under enormous pressure as the invasion approached, was forced once again to deal with a political crisis created by George Patton's inability to think before speaking. Eisenhower considered relieving Patton of command entirely, sending him home, ending his combat career before Third Army ever became operational. Marshall supported that option. Many of Eisenhower's staff officers recommended it. The pattern was clear. Patton would never change. He would continue creating problems, making inflammatory statements, requiring constant management and damage control. Perhaps it was better to cut losses now rather than risk what disaster he might cause once actual combat operations began. But Bradley spoke up for Patton. He told Eisenhower that whatever Patton's flaws as a public figure, he remained the most aggressive pursuit commander in the Army, and that once the breakout from Normandy occurred, they would need someone who could exploit opportunities ruthlessly. Bradley essentially saved Patton's career by vouching for his tactical value, even while acknowledging his political liabilities. Patton never thanked him for it. When Patton finally learned that he was being retained, that Third Army would activate as planned, he attributed it to Marshall's intervention or Eisenhower's eventual recognition of Patton's indispensability. He never acknowledged that Bradley had protected him, had argued for him, had put his own reputation on the line to keep Patton in the war.
On June 6, 1944, D-Day, George Patton was in England. He listened to radio reports of the landings, heard about the fighting on Omaha Beach, the airborne drops behind enemy lines, the desperate struggle to establish a beachhead against German defenses. Bradley was in France, commanding First Army, coordinating the assault, making decisions that would determine whether the invasion succeeded or collapsed into disaster. Montgomery was directing British and Canadian forces. Eisenhower was managing the entire operation from his headquarters. And Patton was sitting in a manor house in Cheshire, commanding an army group that didn't exist, waiting for permission to join a war that was happening without him. He gave a speech to Phantom FUSAG units on June 7th, a performance designed to be observed and reported by German intelligence assets. He inspected non-existent tank battalions. He reviewed fake operational plans with his skeleton staff. He played his role in the deception perfectly because George Patton understood duty and orders and military necessity, even when those orders required him to sit idle while other men made history. The deception worked brilliantly. German intelligence believed FUSAG was real, believed Patton would lead the main invasion at Pas-de-Calais, kept multiple divisions stationed there waiting for an attack that never came. Those divisions could have reinforced Normandy during the critical first weeks, could have pushed the Allies back into the sea, could have turned D-Day into a catastrophic failure. But they stayed at Calais because the Germans feared George Patton more than they feared any other Allied commander, and they would not leave themselves vulnerable to wherever he might strike. It was strategically brilliant. It saved thousands of Allied lives, and it meant that George Patton's greatest contribution to D-Day was not being there. Third Army finally became operational on August 1, 1944, nearly 2 months after D-Day. By then, Bradley's First Army and the British Second Army had finally broken out of the Normandy hedgerows after weeks of brutal fighting. The German defensive line had collapsed. Open country lay ahead. This was exactly the situation Patton had been designed for. The chance to take armor and motorized infantry and drive deep into enemy territory, cutting supply lines, bypassing strongpoints, creating chaos in the German rear areas. And Patton was magnificent. Third Army's advance across France in August and September 1944 was one of the great achievements of the war. Patton's divisions covered distances in weeks that would have taken months in World War I. They liberated French cities, destroyed German units, captured tens of thousands of prisoners, advanced so fast that their supply lines couldn't keep up with them. Patton drove his commanders mercilessly, demanded they keep moving even when they were exhausted, showed up at forward command posts to personally push stalled attacks forward. He was doing exactly what he had always said he could do, proving that aggressive leadership and armored exploitation could win campaigns faster and cheaper than methodical advances. But he was doing it under Bradley's direction, following Bradley's operational plans, coordinating with Bradley's other armies, and Patton hated it. Every time he had to stop because Bradley ordered him to consolidate, every time he had to divert forces because Bradley wanted to support a different axis of advance, every time he had to explain his plans to Bradley and wait for approval, Patton felt the resentment building. In September 1944, when fuel supplies became critically short because the logistics system couldn't support the rapid advance of multiple armies simultaneously, Eisenhower had to make a choice about priorities. He could give fuel to Montgomery's 21st Army Group for a thrust toward the Ruhr, or he could give it to Bradley's 12th Army Group for a broad front advance, or he could give it primarily to Patton's 3rd Army for a dash toward the Saar. Eisenhower chose to support Montgomery's Operation Market Garden, the airborne assault on bridges in Holland. Bradley got enough supplies to maintain his positions but not to conduct major offensives. Patton's 3rd Army had to halt its advance and wait. Patton was furious. He believed the war could have been won by Christmas if he had been given the fuel to keep driving east. He blamed Bradley for not fighting harder to support 3rd Army. He blamed Eisenhower for choosing Montgomery over American commanders. He blamed everyone except himself for creating the political situations that made it impossible for Eisenhower to fully trust him with independent command. The relationship between Bradley and Patton became increasingly strained through the fall of 1944. They remained professional in their communications, but the warmth that had once existed, the mentorship and mutual respect, was gone. Bradley found Patton exhausting to manage.
constantly demanding more resources, constantly complaining about being held back, constantly taking risks that created problems for other units. Patton found Bradley uninspiring, overly cautious, unwilling to accept the risks necessary for decisive victory. Then in December 1944, the Germans launched their surprise offensive through the Ardennes, the attack that became known as the Battle of the Bulge. American forces were caught off guard. 2 divisions were overrun. German armor penetrated deep into Allied lines. The entire front was in crisis. Eisenhower called an emergency conference at Verdun on December 19th to coordinate the Allied response. Bradley attended, Patton attended, Montgomery attended, various corps and army commanders.
Eisenhower asked how quickly forces could be shifted north to counterattack the German penetration. Montgomery estimated it would take several weeks. Bradley suggested 10 days might be possible. Patton said he could attack in 2 days with 3 divisions. Everyone in the room thought he was exaggerating, making his usual boast about Third Army's capabilities. Eisenhower challenged him directly. "When can you really attack, George?" Patton pulled out a notebook and showed Eisenhower 3 separate contingency plans he had already prepared for exactly this scenario, complete with movement orders, artillery coordinates, and logistics arrangements. "I can attack on December 22nd with 3 divisions, sir. 6 divisions by December 24th. Patton delivered. Third Army disengaged from its current operations, pivoted 90 degrees north, moved over icy roads in terrible weather, and launched a major attack exactly on schedule. The relief of Bastogne, the destruction of the German salient, the recovery of Allied momentum all involved multiple armies and commanders. But Patton's rapid response and aggressive execution were critical to the outcome. For the first time in months, Eisenhower and Bradley were reminded of why they had kept Patton despite his problems. No one else in the Army could have done what he did at the Bulge. But even that triumph couldn't repair the damage between Patton and Bradley. Patton believed he deserved more credit than he received, that the press coverage focused too much on Montgomery's role and not enough on Third Army's crucial counterattack. He believed Bradley had downplayed his contribution in official reports. He believed, as always, that he was being unfairly treated by lesser men. In March 1945, as Allied armies closed in on Germany from both east and west, Patton's Third Army crossed the Rhine River at Oppenheim without waiting for formal authorization, without massive artillery preparation, without the careful planning that characterized most Rhine crossings. He just did it because he saw an opportunity and seized it, because that was how George Patton operated. Then he called Bradley on the phone and said with obvious satisfaction, "Brad, don't tell anyone, but I'm across. We sneaked a division over last night." It was Patton's way of showing he could accomplish through initiative and daring what others required elaborate planning to achieve. Bradley congratulated him, told him to exploit the crossing, and hung up. Then he said to his chief of staff, "George will never change. He'll always be trying to prove he's the best commander in the theater." His chief of staff asked if that bothered him. Bradley thought for a moment and said, "No, I wouldn't want him any other way. We need someone who fights like that. I just wish he understood that wars are won by armies, not by individual generals." The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Germany surrendered. The celebrations began. Officers who had commanded armies were reassigned to occupation duties or brought home. The question of post-war command arrangements came up. Bradley was promoted to 4-star general and given command of the Veterans Administration, taking him out of active military command. Patton was given command of Third Army in occupation duty in Bavaria. It should have been a quiet administrative position, a way to wind down a combat career, a reward for service rendered. But Patton couldn't stop being Patton. He made comments to reporters about the Soviet Union being the next enemy. He refused to aggressively pursue denazification. He compared Nazi party members to Republicans and Democrats, just people with different political views. He complained publicly about occupation policies. He criticized decisions being made in Washington. And in September 1945, Eisenhower, tired of the constant problems, relieved him of command of 3rd Army and gave him command of 15th Army, a paper headquarters with no real responsibilities. Patton knew his career was over. He was 60 years old, too old for another war, too controversial for peacetime command. He talked about resigning, about retiring to his home in Massachusetts, about writing his memoirs. In December 1945, while on a hunting trip in Germany, his car was hit by a truck. Patton suffered severe neck injuries. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He died 12 days later, on December 21, 1945, without ever recovering mobility. Bradley attended the funeral. He stood in the rain at the American Cemetery in Luxembourg, where Patton was buried among the soldiers of 3rd Army. He gave a eulogy that praised Patton's courage, his tactical genius, his inspirational leadership. He said that history would remember George Patton as one of the great commanders of the war, that his contributions to victory were immeasurable, that the Army had lost a warrior without equal. What Bradley didn't say, what he couldn't say at a funeral with reporters present and Patton's family listening, was that George Patton had also been impossible, had made every job harder, had created unnecessary problems, had subordinated everything to his own ambition and pride, that Patton's genius came with costs that others had to pay, that loving George Patton and wanting to strangle him were not contradictory feelings, but two parts of the same complicated relationship.
Bradley lived another 36 years. He served as Chief of Staff of the Army, then as the first Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was promoted to 5-star rank, General of the Army, an honor that would have tortured Patton had he lived to see it. Bradley wrote his memoirs in the 1950s. He was generous to Patton in those pages, praising his combat leadership, minimizing their conflicts, presenting their relationship as one of mutual respect despite occasional disagreements. But in private conversations with close friends, Bradley was more honest. He said that Patton had been the most talented tactical commander he ever served with, and also the most difficult subordinate any Army group commander ever had to manage. That Patton had won battles through sheer force of personality and aggressive action, but had never understood that wars required more than brilliant tactics. They required logistics, diplomacy, political awareness, the ability to work within organizational structures. Patton had despised all of that, had seen it as weakness rather than necessity, and had paid the price in a career that should have reached higher heights but was constantly derailed by self-inflicted wounds. The story of that staff car sitting outside Norfolk House in January 1944, refusing to drive the final 40 feet after sitting in cold drizzle nursing his resentment for 23 minutes after making everyone wait because waiting was the only power he had left, Eisenhower had greeted him with a smile and proceeded with the briefing as if nothing was wrong, because Eisenhower understood that George Patton's pride was the price you paid for George Patton's brilliance. And that price, however irritating, however exhausting, was worth paying if it meant having the best pursuit commander in the American Army available when the breakout from Normandy finally came. Wars are won by imperfect men, led by other imperfect men, the genius and the manager, the warrior and the organizer, the man who lived for glory and the man who just wanted to get the job done. Neither one could have won alone. Both were necessary. And if they never quite reconciled the differences in temperament and ambition that divided them, they at least understood that their mission was larger than their pride. Except on that one afternoon, when pride won for 23 minutes, and a staff car sat motionless outside Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, while two men who should have been allies struggled with the weight of rank and resentment and all the complicated feelings that come from being excluded from the most important operation in history by men you believe are your inferiors, while knowing deep down that your own mistakes made that exclusion inevitable, and hating them for it anyway.